This is how I came up with the idea for Clandestine Candidate. It started back in the mid-1990s when I drank well water polluted with a chemical additive to gasoline called MTBE. It ruined my health and made me very sensitive to automobile exhaust fumes. Since I lived by a big highway, it made my life a living hell. And on top of that, since the oil companies have so much power in Washington, there was never any testing done on how MTBE affects us, so I couldn't get treatment or sue the people responsible for what happened. Had to wear a charcoal filter respirator outside and when I was driving. Sometimes I even had to wear it inside my home. I researched MTBE looking for an angle, something that would give me a way to address the issue politically. I found a lot of bad things out about it, but no one in Washington cared. Then I discovered something that changed everything. I had a large collection of valuable perennials in my yard. I was going to use them to do landscaping in shopping centers. They were all I had left that were worth anything. There was a drought going on, but I had to be careful being outside watering because of the pollution. So I followed weather patterns very closely, watching out for thunderstorms that would help me. Over time I realized there were variations in weather patterns that were like my health problems, so I began to look for evidence that MTBE was causing the drought. I found a NASA scientist named Drew Shendell who had a theory where he claimed weather patterns are affected by certain chemicals as they go into the air. That weather patterns change according to certain pollutants we put in the atmosphere. I emailed him for clarification and got back a response saying MTBE pollutants caused changes in weather patterns like I had found. He later declined to answer any more questions after I told him I'd been talking about MTBE being where the pollution was coming from. He later testified that the Bush administration edits his work before it's released to the public and that the end product doesn't look anything like what he originally said. He even said that the guy who does it was from the oil industry. In 2004 he was chosen as one of Scientific American's top 50 scientists, the first time a NASA scientist ever received this kind of recognition. But all the public heard was his boss, Jim Hansen, talking about carbon dioxide being responsible for weather pattern changes. I actually have an email from Drew Shendell from around that same time claiming carbon dioxide has nothing to do with global warming. When I found my theory about MTBE causing weather pattern changes was supported by science, I called the Washington Times newspaper. I talked to a reporter on a Friday in July of 1999. She said she would look into my theory but didn't think she could publish a story that would hurt the oil industry without expert testimony or a court record to back it up with. This was 6 years after MTBE use started. The story then had been largely masked over by the news media, who reported MTBE was good for air quality with nothing much ever said against it. 2 days after I talked to her, on a Sunday, the EPA's Blue Ribbon Task Force on MTBE recommended that the additive be removed from gasoline immediately. The next day, President Bill Clinton, Vice President Al Gore, the heads of the EPA and Department of Agriculture, publicly called for an end to the use of MTBE. Their reaction seemed to me to have been a flinch, a nervous reaction to a scandal. After a while, the story was removed to the back pages of newspapers where most people wouldn't have a clue what was going on. Within weeks of their announcement, my health began to get better and weather patterns returned to normal after a great deal of violent storm patterns erupting nationwide. The story goes on and is so long that it would take countless hours of video clips to tell it to you on YouTube. George Bush and his father are intimate players in helping the MTBE industry get started in the first place. Enron and its former CEO Ken Lay, Halliburton, ex-Senator Phil Gramm and his new employers, the United Bank of Switzerland, all of the members of the House and Senate in 1990 who unanimously voted to have MTBE put in our gasoline, the press who didn't follow this sensitive story, and countless others who participated in keeping this story from coming out, all viewed me as their enemy. I was eventually arrested and flown to Houston, where the federal judge who got my case was Ewing Warline. He had actually been appointed by George Bush Sr. at the time MTBE use first began. I later found, after refusing to step down from my case, that he helped Enron set up its energy trader which was an internet network used to produce and put MTBE on the market without there being a central controlling agency to oversee its use. I fought the system, getting 3 attorneys fired, and later represented myself. On the eve of a federal psychiatrist finding me delusional for my claims about MTBE, an article was published that I got a copy of that told the same story I had been accused of being insane for thinking was true. I was taken back to Houston the next day, where I fought for a total of 13 months from within the federal prison system until they realized I wouldn't give up and they finally let me go home. Although the scientist from Nassau won't answer my emails anymore, what he's already sent me confirms that ethanol has the same effects on weather patterns as MTBE and is just as bad for your health. But you see, they couldn't have just stopped using these additives, or would have validated my story when weather patterns would have returned to normal just after MTBE use was ended. Yeah, I know it's hard to believe that they're doing all this just to keep me from looking like I know what I'm talking about. And you're right, I'm not what it's all about. Not anymore. They learned a long time ago that no one's going to ever listen to me. So why do they keep doing it if no one would know what's going on if they stop? There can only be one reason. You see, ever since MTBE first started being used, the medical industry has enjoyed record profits. As their profits steadily grew, they borrowed trillions of dollars based on their projected future earnings. And a lot of what they've invested in isn't doing well, especially since Enron crashed, starting the downfall of Wall Street, and of course the beginning of the war on terror. The only reason the economy hasn't crashed is because we're going trillions of dollars in debt, paying companies like Halliburton, who are largely responsible for what's happened, so they can cover the costs of pretending none of this is going on. So if additives like MTBE and ethanol were to be stopped being used, the resulting health benefits to Americans would cause a drop in sales of pharmaceutical and medical services, which would cost trillions of dollars in global corporate loans to go into default. In fact, there's an additive to gasoline which gives 20% more mileage with 70% less pollution. MTBE was chosen instead of it during the creation of the Clean Air Act of 1990. This, along with a lot of other evidence, makes it clear that whoever's pulling our elected official strings knew from the beginning that MTBE would make Americans sick and wanted to profit from it, just like they're doing now with ethanol.